Hello, good to see you here. Mr. Monarchist Man, if you could just invite some people over, that would be great, and then we'll get started. Especially Julius, make sure you get Julius to come. If you know, can get him. Actually, also, what's his name? The other guy, Ollie. Send this to him. Might find it interesting. I guess we can just go through my channel in the meantime. See how my Trolls playlist is doing. 39 views, not terrible, it's not great either though. Clashing Creeds. I got 84 views, bro. Yo, it's a slow stream I've had so far. What's going on? DM Niewski. Okay, thanks. I just quit Discord. Let's wait like a couple more minutes. If not, I guess it'll just be the two of us. Should be very sad, but whatever. It's crazy. You can have like 3,000 subs and only one guy's in your stream. You can hear me, right? Just gonna make sure. You just type in the chat. Yeah, I would think he's here too, but he seems to be on whatever that mode is. Okay, good that you can hear me okay. Bruh. This would be wild if it's just only you. Oh, good. Good to see you, Uncle Sam. You can try to get some other people, but I've been waiting here like 8 minutes now, so we should get started because I don't want to waste too much time. So, nice to see you here. You guys can also tell them we're going to cover the Crusades. I mean, that's what we're starting off with, so maybe that'll make people a little more interested. Yeah. All right, well... Welcome, folks. You kind of know the drill already, especially because you two were here in my previous streams. We're just going over Christian history, unbiased mostly. Try to make it a little funny, a little off script. Yeah, let's get to it. For the Imperium. Seljuk threat. So the Seljuk Turks were a nomadic group who had converted to Islam and migrated to Iran to seek their fortune. And often their leaders were independent princes competing to conquer land. They were founded by Tughril I, who founded the Seljuk Sultanate in Transoxiana, so that's, I think, roughly Turkmenistan area. And by his death in 1063, he'd conquered most of modern Iran and Iraq, bringing him directly to the Eastern Roman Empire's border. The Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes tried to stop Seljuk raids, but was defeated and imprisoned at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. One of the most important battles in Eastern Roman history. And actually a video I watched pretty recently went over that battle in detail. Now, the Eastern Romans ended up nearly losing all of Anatolia, and the Seljuks also conquered the Levant the same year from the Fatimids, just to make it even worse. And here is the Battle of Manzikert. The Seljuks are just destroying the Eastern Romans there. So to make things even worse, the Seljuks violently persecuted Christians, especially those on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Although they were technically allowed to go there, they were forced to pay heavy taxes and were often attacked with the permission of the authorities. Churches were burnt down, monks were killed, nuns were raped, and desperate for help, Eastern Roman Emperor Alexios I Komnenos wrote a letter to Robert II, Count of Flanders, warning that if Constantinople fell, that thousands more Christians would be tortured, raped, and killed. He also warned that many of Jesus' relics would be destroyed. So, although Pope Urban II personally was outraged by the treatment of Christians, he also likely wanted to mend that East-West schism which we went over last time that had happened 41 years earlier, and reassert his authority over the Eastern Orthodox Church, because the popes never miss an opportunity to take authority once again over the Eastern Orthodox. In 1095, he called the Council of Clermont to decide how the Catholic Church should militarily respond to the situation. And in July, he returned to his homeland in France to recruit men for his expedition. So here is a picture of the Council of Clermont as imagined. Probably wasn't this dramatic, but you get the vibe, right? A bunch of men out there being preached at, being told to go to war. So let's learn a little more about this council. On the 27th of November, the Pope gave an impassioned speech to a large audience of French nobility and clergy. The Pope emphasized that since Europe was already a violent place, they might as well just use that violence against infidels instead of fellow Christians. He also noted the importance of helping out the Eastern Romans and reminded his audiences of the crimes being committed against Catholics and Eastern Orthodox pilgrims alike. He also described this war as an armed pilgrimage and offered, most importantly, to forgive the sins of anyone who participated. Now, had this power really been used before? Not really, but this would be a power that would maybe, spoiler alert, come to backfire on the Catholics centuries later. However, his speech was so inspiring at the time that the crowd yelled Deus vult, or God's wills it. So if you see anyone screaming Deus vult today and you do not know what that means, that is the origin. And so here is a more dramatic version of the Council of Clermont. I don't think everyone was falling over, about to faint like it looks like in this image, but still pretty cool. Now let's learn a little bit about the cult leader Hermit. So preparations were made for this new holy war, which would officially set out on the 15th of August 1096, the Feast of the Assumption. And actually this stream is being recorded on the 22nd of August, so just 1 week later. However, before this happened, a number of armies consisting of peasants and minor nobles set off for Jerusalem, led by a priest called Peter the Hermit. He was the most successful preacher of Pope Urban's message and developed a hysterical enthusiasm among his followers, even though the Pope never endorsed him officially. However, the problem is that enthusiasm does not make up for discipline, and Peter's army soon found themselves plundering fellow Christian territories instead of actually attacking their enemies. The preaching of the Crusade led to the Rhineland massacre of Jews, and they were attacked across France and Germany. This led to a large-scale massacre of Jews in Mainz, in which Kalonymus ben Meshulam, the chief rabbi, chose to kill himself rather than get killed by the mob. Many of the Crusaders wanted to force the local Jews to convert to Christianity, but, they may have also wanted to steal their money. When the Crusaders entered Catholic Hungary, they began pillaging the kingdom, causing King Koloman to defeat them in battle, ironically making the first Crusader battle against a fellow Catholic kingdom. Now, Peter finally got to Constantinople in August 1096, and his army began to pillage outside the city in search of food and supply. So I'm sensing a pattern here. Emperor Alexios wanted them to get the hell out of there, so he quickly shipped them across the Bosphorus Strait to Asia and said, "You guys go pillage my enemies instead." After this, the different armies split up and began pillaging the countryside, eventually making it to the Sultanate of Rum. But the far more experienced Turks just came in and massacred everyone. The final major battle took place in October at Civitot, where the archers of Rome destroyed the Crusader army, and that was the anticlimactic end of the People's Crusade. And here they are on their way there, although from their faces, maybe this is the survivors, I can't tell. Either way, it did not end very well. So let's just check in on the chat. Okay, welcome World Builder, nice to see you here. Yeah. Again, if you guys can invite other people, that would be great. I'm trying to get Nioski to come because, I did do the stream now so that I could do it before he left for the Sabbath. So if you guys can invite him, that would be good. Yeah, otherwise, let's keep going. So, while the People's Crusade failed, the main force led by nobles and their knights began preparing with about 70 to 80,000 men recruited. Now, although that army doesn't seem necessarily that huge, you have to understand at the time, the average, even powerful kings were fielding armies of like 10,000 max. So to get 80,000 men to gather together was insane. Probably the largest army in Europe since the Romans. Now, the first man to take the cross was Adhémar of Le Puy, the bishop of Puy-en-Velay, and he became Pope Urban's official representative. Meanwhile, Urban spent 1095 and 1096 spreading his message across France and urged his bishops to preach across France, Germany, and Italy. However, Urban's call for a crusade actually ended up being so successful that he couldn't contain it, and many groups that weren't even intent to join just did so, such as monks, the sick, and even women. And so I can just imagine this being some sort of like viral social media challenge today if it happened. Also, you have to admire Adhémar of Le Puy. You know, he has the bishop's staff and the sword. Looks hella cool. So let's introduce our leaders. Now, despite the popular support for this crusade, Urban ensured that the army would be led by knights. You know, maybe it has something to do with the peasants being massacred. And the Crusade's main leaders would be Bohemond, the Prince of Taranto, as well as his nephew Tancred, Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lotharingia, and his brother Baldwin of Boulogne, Hugh, the Count of Vermandois, who was the brother of Philip I, the King of the Franks, Robert Curthose, the Duke of Normandy and the brother of William II of England, and his relative Stephen, Count of Blois, and Robert II, Count of Flanders. If you notice, by the way, all of these people are French. Yes, some of them came from Flanders or England, but those were also ruled by the French at the time. And so here we have Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Godfrey of Bouillon. Remember these names, they will be important. So these men were divided into 4 separate armies that didn't always cooperate but had a common goal. They often left everything behind, with Robert Curthose giving up his duchy as a loan to his brother. Meanwhile, Godfrey of Bouillon sold all his property to the church. The different Crusader armies used separate routes to reach Constantinople, with Godfrey of Bouillon taking the land route through the Balkans, Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, leading his army down the Adriatic coast, and Bohemond of Taranto just sailing there. The Crusaders arrived with little food and really needed Alexios I to open up his home, so to say, to them. Not literally, but open up a city to them. So here is a map of what was going on. So, I mean, I think this is is this Turkish? Anyways, whatever it is, we get the point. So essentially, this is Raymond. He comes from Toulouse, going down here. We got Godfrey going down here. We got Bohemond. He went straight here. And who am I missing? Oh yeah, Robert of Flanders, of course. He went the long way. And this is Emperor Alexios I, in case you're wondering what he looked like. Now we get to the homies reuniting Constantinople. Now obviously Alexios I was maybe a little bit suspicious of these armies after what the previous People's Crusade had done, and because Bohemond of Taranto was an old enemy of his who had invaded his empire several times. Although some Crusaders expected him to lead the army, he wasn't concerned with joining them, but instead with transporting them across the Bosphorus. Now he made a deal. I'll give you food and supplies, and you guys have to swear loyalty to me and promise to return any land taken from Rome back to the Eastern Romans. Now starting with Godfrey of Bouillon, every Crusader leader agreed except Raymond IV. That might be a problem, foreshadowing. Now in early 1097, the Crusaders linked up with Peter the Hermit, because apparently he was still around, and what little remained of his forces. Their first goal was to capture Nicaea, which now served as Rome's capital, and if you have been following the series at all, you'll remember that Nicaea was the site of not one, but 2 ecumenical councils, so kind of a big deal. Now its Sultan, Kilij Arslan I, did not take this threat seriously, understandably so, because of what happened with the last crusade, and he was not in town when the siege began, but he rushed back and engaged in battle, but was actually driven back after a month, and after a month Nicaea fell. Now the Crusaders were angry that they couldn't just loot the city, because apparently this seems to be what all the Crusaders want to do, but Alexios bought them off. But we can see that the cooperation between the Eastern Romans and Crusaders was already starting to fragment, and if anything, the relationship between the Crusaders and the Eastern Romans was like the relationship between their churches is not going to last very long. But here we have them at the Siege of Nicaea, and the drip is just crazy. I love the drip of the Crusades. Now, after the Siege of Nicaea, the Crusader army split into two, with one army consisting of Frenchmen and the other consisting of Normans, who were basically just Vikings who spoke French. Now, these Normans marched ahead and were attacked by Kilij Arslan, who surrounded them. Luckily, the French army under Godfrey of Bouillon arrived and broke through the enemy line, causing the forces of Roum to retreat. Realizing he couldn't defeat the Crusaders, Kilij Arslan burned and destroyed everything that he could. With little food left, many men and horses died, causing the Crusaders to often pillage their way across Anatolia. Making things worse, somehow the leaders thought the best thing to do at that point was argue about who was the boss of the crusade instead of trying to survive. Now, after reaching the edge of the Anatolian Peninsula, or in other words Turkey, Baldwin of Boulogne broke off from the army and headed towards the land of the Cilician Armenians, where he captured Edessa. Despite the Eastern Romans only having lost the city 10 years earlier, they did not actually demand that Baldwin hand it over, and this allowed the Crusaders to secure a food supply as well as hire local mercenaries. To secure his rule, Baldwin made himself the Count of Edessa in 1098, and he married a local Armenian woman named Arda. Edessa would become what would later become known as the First Crusader state, and more would be set up in the future. And here is Baldwin of Boulogne in front of Edessa. Now, on the 20th October 1097, the Crusaders started the siege of Antioch, but it was so large that there weren't even enough soldiers to surround the city. Over the next 8 months, thousands of Crusaders were dying of starvation, and Adhémar of Le Puy decided that there was too much sin in the camp, and there was only one solution, which was to kick out all the women, because of course. During this desperate situation, Bohemond of Taranto convinced the other leaders that in exchange for him keeping the city, he would find an Armenian commander willing to let the Crusaders in. Surely enough, an Armenian named Firuz opened a gate on the 2nd of June 1098, and then blew horns to tell the Christians to open the other gates. Alright, let's check in on the chat now. Okay, not much. If you guys have any comments on the crusade so far, just type it out here. Oh, we got one more member, maybe? I hope so. We have these three. We're getting a fourth. They should have stopped in Jerusalem. We'll get to Jerusalem, and then we can discuss that a little more. All right. So this is Antioch being stormed, and this is Bohemond who captured it. So, however, just after having taken the city from the Muslims, Kerboga, the ruler of Mosul, showed up 2 days later with 40,000 men. His armies attacked non-stop, day and night for 4 days. Crusader morale was super low, and many considered giving up. But, remember, just when you think it's over, we are so back. And at this crucial moment, a soldier named Peter Bartholomew claimed that Andrew the Apostle came to him to show him the location of the spear that pierced Jesus. This boosted morale, and eventually the Crusaders marched out of the city to meet Kerboga's men, who were disorganized and lost the battle. As promised, Bohemond laid claim to the city, but this caused a dispute that led to the leaders wasting the entire rest of the year arguing about who would get the prize. And here we have Peter Bartholomew discovering the lance. You can see that over here. And now the crusade starts to collapse. In 1099, Bohemond was finally left to be Prince of Antioch, while the rest of the army just continued without him down the Mediterranean coast, encountering surprisingly little resistance. Raymond IV had convinced many of the remaining leaders to submit to his rule in exchange for getting land in Tripoli, which he promised that he would capture and then rule. Now, there was a lot of disunity in the Crusader leadership because Adhémar of Le Puy died of plague after the siege of Antioch, and he had been really the one keeping everyone together. Many had started accusing Peter Bartholomew of having faked his discovery of the spear, and he was challenged to a trial by fire because this was before we had AI detectors, so that was the best way we could distinguish reality from fiction. Now, unsurprisingly, he actually just got burnt, who knew, and he died of his wounds. And this was proof that he had faked the entire spear incident, because after all, if it had really been from God, he would have been protected. Now, this backfired a lot on Raymond, because he was the main guy supporting Peter Bartholomew. Here's Peter Bartholomew walking through the fire. Now, funnily enough, while all this was happening, the Emirate of Damascus, which had controlled Jerusalem, actually lost the city to the invading Fatimid forces. The Fatimids tried to make a deal with the Crusaders by promising pilgrims free passage in exchange for peace, but this was rejected because they'd come all this way and they were not about to give up. As such, the governor of Jerusalem kicked out all Christians from the city and poisoned most of the area's wells. On the 13th of May, the Crusaders reached Tripoli, where the local governor provided the Crusaders with horses in an attempt to kick out the Fatimids. On the 6th of June, Tancred of Hauteville captured Bethlehem, and the next day they finally reached Jerusalem, which was their ultimate aim. And now we get to Jerusalem. So since the Crusaders had no water or food supplies and might be attacked by the local Fatimids at any moment, they didn't have time to blockade the city and had to assault it instead, with only 12,000 men left out of the roughly 80,000 who had departed. The first assault failed, and the leaders realized that they would either coordinate or fail. Morale was pretty low, but another man received a vision in which Adhémar of Le Puy, the bishop who had led the crusade, came to him in a dream and told the men to fast and march barefoot around the walls, similarly to how Jericho fell. The procession ended on the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit gave them a sermon, because apparently Peter the Hermit is still here. I don't know how. He's just like that one character who doesn't leave. And as news arrived that the Fatimid army was arriving, it was now or never. The assault began on the 13th of July, and 2 days later they breached the walls and entered the city. And here we have the Crusaders celebrating their victory after 3 years of long and hard combat to finally take the holy city once again for Christianity. So after 462 years of Muslim occupation, Jerusalem was finally liberated, and the First Crusade had successfully achieved its goal. On the 22nd of July, a council was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to decide what the plan was. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as the leader, and he became the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, very sadly, Pope Urban II had died 14 days after the fall of Jerusalem, never knowing about how successful his mission had actually been. Many crusaders returned home, and only 2,300 soldiers remained to defend the land. Godfrey died a year later in 1100 and was succeeded by his brother Baldwin, who became the first king of Jerusalem. And here's Pope Urban, here's Godfrey of Bouillon, and here are the 4 Crusader states, the ones we mentioned: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. Alright, so let's see what you guys thought of the First Crusade, and then we'll move on back to more church politics. Yeah, so if there was more coronation things, it might have been less murky. I agree. I mean, the thing is, some of you may know, some of you may not know, but World Builders Ministries and I actually are working on a collaboration right now about what if the Crusades succeeded. So definitely I would recommend that you guys watch it once we're done. Yeah, it does suck to die before knowing you succeed, because the thing is, right, Urban actually died after they took Jerusalem. So, if he had social media at the time, he could have known, but unfortunately news traveled pretty slow. I'm looking forward to the collab as well. It will be fun. My official opinion on the Crusade is Napoleon Bonaparte, sir. Yes, that's the only correct position on the Crusades. Alright, let's get back to the investiture controversy again. So this thing was still going on. Now it made its way to England, where King Henry I refused to stop appointing bishops. Although this angered the Pope, he needed England's support in the Crusades and in standing up to the Holy Roman Empire. They eventually came to a deal in 1107, but this would not last very long. When Henry V became Holy Roman Emperor in 1105, he continued to appoint bishops to the mild displeasure of Pope Paschal II. He eventually then crossed his army into Italy in 1111 and forced the Pope to come to a compromise where he would control church land in exchange for no longer appointing bishops. Now, although Henry held Paschal hostage, the moment he left Italy, Paschal basically just was like, psych, and then excommunicated the emperor. As such, Henry appointed his own pope, called Gregory VIII, which led to many German nobles rebelling against him and his false pope. Eventually, the chaos was too much for Henry, and he decided to give up his right to appoint bishops, or the pope. And in 1122, he met with Pope Calixtus II at Worms and created a concordat. The agreement saw Henry giving up the right to appoint bishops in exchange for retaining the right to influence the choices. This ended the investiture controversy and significantly weakened the Holy Roman Emperor's power over the Pope, meaning that the Pope gets 1 point and the Emperor gets nothing. And this is Pope Paschal II. I mean, this guy, you can tell this guy is just like the kind of old man to sit under a tree and just enjoy life. Like, look at him. Literally looks like a tortoise. And there's Henry, looking a little goofy. Maybe he should shave that stash a little bit more. So during the momentous events of the First Crusade, a less loud but equally impactful movement was happening within Europe itself. In 1098, Citeaux Abbey was founded as the first Cistercian monastery, with these people being a group of monks who wanted to return to the original Benedictine rule, something which the Benedictines themselves had failed to do. They were led by the charismatic Bernard of Clairvaux and his Cistercian movement, which helped spread technology across Europe. By the end of the 1100s, there were 500 Cistercian monasteries, which often helped connect rural areas with better technology and farming methods. And here it is. It all started from this humble monastery here in France. So let's learn a little bit more about the monasteries at this time. Now, they served the function of preserving and copying ancient manuscripts, storing and studying medication, and the requirement of wine for mass helped develop wine culture. Monasteries controlled public administration and education, although the educational dispute between Peter Abelard and William of Champeaux over philosophy led to the students and professors of the University of Notre Dame, which led to the establishment of free schools. Now, monasteries also had a disproportionately high number of second sons, most of which were sent there so that their older brother could get all the inheritance. So basically, if you're a second born son, you get screwed. Luckily, I'm an oldest, so it doesn't matter. So I just mentioned universities, and it was really during the 11th and the 12th centuries that universities first came to prominence in Europe. Universities began just as cathedral schools, with all students being clergy, but eventually these cathedral schools became detached from their cathedrals and formed their own institutions, with the first one being the University of Bologna in 1088 and the University of Oxford in 1096. At these universities, a new philosophy known as scholasticism emerged in the first half of the 12th century, which tried to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian theology. Its main goal was to resolve contradictions and answer questions. Now, scholasticism is said often to have begun with the teachings of Anselm of Canterbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1093 to 1109, who was the first prominent Christian philosopher to appeal to reason instead of just appealing to authority. During the second half of the 12th century, the complete works of Aristotle were rediscovered, which led to what became known as the Renaissance of the 12th century. It revived the scientific study of nature, which would eventually lead to the scientific revolution of the future. However, it is important to note that these developments were limited to Catholic Europe and never happened in Eastern Christianity. At this point, the most popular style of architecture for Catholic churches was the Romanesque style, which combined massive walls, rounded arches, and ceilings of masonry. It didn't have large windows, so these churches were brightly painted with scenes from the Bible and the lives of the saints to compensate. All of this would be revolutionized by the completion of the Basilica of St. Denis in Paris in 1144, which would become the first example of Gothic architecture. The style was characterized by high and pointed arches, large windows, improved lighting, and geometric harmony. Its ultimate aim was to direct the worshipper's mind up to God, who is high up and orderly, and this ended up creating what is objectively the most beautiful architectural style of all time. I mean, just look at this. This is incredible. So let's take a moment to just appreciate the beauty of this. Yeah, that's actually a good question. How would the world look like if the emperor had won the investiture controversy instead of the pope? Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, it would be a good altist. I can't really answer the question currently because I don't really know enough, but I can imagine that it would probably lead to like more authoritarianism and state control long term in Europe. So yeah, thank God you call art and beauty objective. I mean, it just is, right? Like we all know this, right? You can't look at this and then tell me, oh yeah, it looks just as good as like a banana taped on a wall, right? Here. Oh. Lower your volume, man. Lower your volume. You can hear everything. All right, bro. We only have two. Anyways, whatever. Just keep going. Now let's get to the Second Crusade. So in 1144, Imad al-Din Zengi, the emir of Mosul, conquered Edessa, and in response, Pope Eugene III called for a crusade to take it back. King Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany led separate armies into Anatolia in 1147, but they were both defeated by the armies of Rome. The next year, the French and German armies actually made to Jerusalem, and from there launched an attack on Damascus, which once again failed. The Second Crusade was a failure by its end in 1149, with no major victories by the Crusaders. The only place the crusade was ironically successful at was on the other side of the Mediterranean, where a group of crusaders stopped in Portugal to help King Afonso I of Portugal conquer Lisbon from the Muslims in 1147. And that may or may not matter for Portuguese history long term. And here we have Bernard of Clairvaux, the guy who was in large part responsible for the Cistercian revival, preaching for the Second Crusade, but unfortunately it went absolutely nowhere. Actually, I think, monarchist man, don't you have some gripe with Bernard? Yes, but now's not the time. All right, we'll discuss it later. Okay, so time to get a map out, right? It's been a while. So let's look at what Christianity looked like in 1160. Well, again, not too much of a difference. We have, of course, Catholic Christianity in the majority of Europe, right? Northern Iberia, France, the Low Countries, Germany, Italy, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, southern Sweden, most of Norway, Iceland, Greenland, parts of Finland. And then also we can see the clear impact of the Crusades here, where now these areas along the Levantine coast are now majority Catholic. Of course, the Orthodox all over the Balkans, Eastern Orthodox that is, Kievan Rus, large parts of Anatolia. Oriental Orthodox are in Armenia, Ethiopia, and Sudan area. But wait, what's this? The Cathars? Well, time to find out. So in 1143, the Catholic Church would face a threat from within that would be far more dangerous than the Islamic threat. During that year, Catharism emerged as a new sect of Christianity, influenced by Gnosticism. So yeah, if you guys thought Gnosticism was just like a 2nd century problem, you're wrong. Now, they believed that there were two gods who created the earth, with one being the New Testament God who created the spiritual realm, and the other being the Old Testament God who created the physical realm. The second god, called the King of the World, was seen as the god of the Jews. That being was associated with Satan, though it remains unclear what their relationship was, with some saying he was Satan's creator, father, or even daddy. And I will not explain what that means. Look it up yourself. Let's look at their theology. Now, unsurprisingly, these clowns also rejected the Trinity and instead adopted non-Trinitarian modalistic monarchianism, which basically means that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one person in every conceivable way. Now, they call themselves the good Christians, but they denied that Jesus ever came in bodily form and thus was never born or even resurrected, which kind of defeats the entire point of Christianity. I mean, like, the incarnation and the resurrection are like the two biggest deals in Christianity, hence why Christmas, Easter. Anyways, whatever. Now, like Docetism, Catharism taught that Jesus was an angel who appeared to be taking human form. Now, Cathars really had some beef with John the Baptist, of all people, who they saw as an evil man sent to set back Jesus' mission through his false sacrament of baptism. They also believed Jesus' resurrection was just a reincarnation. And here is John the Baptist, who they really did not like. Now, to Cathars, everything physical, including the human body, was created by the king of the world, and to them, humans were actually just fallen angels who had joined Satan in his rebellion against the true God. As punishment, they were eternally trapped on earth, but if they renounced their material self completely, they could become angels again. You know, this almost seems like a weird mix of like Buddhism and Mormonism. I don't know if you guys are getting this vibe as well. Now, until this was achieved, they would be stuck in an endless loop of reincarnation. They believed that Jesus basically came to earth to save souls from their physical limits, and after his reincarnation, he came back in the form of Paul. Now, Cathars condemned the moral, spiritual, and political corruption of the Catholic Church and rejected all sacraments, only having one sacrament which was called the consolamentum. In the ceremony, all sin was removed from the believer, and he would be promoted to a prefect, which would induct him into a higher level. Now, many would receive the sacrament as they were close to death, which would liberate them right before they had the chance to fall back into sin. After this, they were expected to no longer eat. Which, what if you don't die right? Anyways. However, if they started recovering from death, then it was actually encouraged to kill the believer so that they would not have the chance to sin again. Because, that's a really good solution, right? If you don't want people to sin, just kill them so that they don't have the chance to sin. Very smart. Let's look at some unique Cathar beliefs. Now, when there were as many believers as sinners, according to the Cathars, the day of judgment would begin, and the believers would ascend to heaven while the sinners would burn in hell with Satan. Now, Cathars were pescatarians, which might seem like just a quirky diet choice, but the reasoning for this was that cheese, eggs, milk, and meat were all byproducts of sexual intercourse, which was very, very naughty. They also believed that all animals except fish carried reincarnated souls and so shouldn't be killed. I actually feel like a lot of, like white leftist women would really like Catharism because of this. Cathars also denied many core Catholic beliefs such as transubstantiation, purgatory, prayer for the dead, and prayer to saints, and believed that the Bible should be written in the local language. And I think this is the only thing where I think I can agree with the Cathars. Now, other beliefs include that war and the death penalty were seen as horrible, even though many of their members were in the military and some of them even assassinated the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau. Unsurprisingly, with how many things they got wrong, the Cathars were also good friends with the Jews, who were appointed to many prominent roles in Cathar territories. The Cathars had a relatively simple structure, one which distinguished between the perfects and the believers, with the perfects being the ones who were allowed full knowledge of Cathar beliefs. Now, what made Cathars radical is that they allowed women into church leadership positions, and they were allowed to administer the sacrament as well as become perfects. To them, Mary Magdalene, here on the right, was the main apostle instead of Peter, and the Cathar stance empowering women attracted many women to this denomination. Now, while female perfects rarely evangelized, they set up house churches that spread the faith. Nevertheless, Cathars were not feminists and still believed that you had to be reincarnated as a man to enter heaven. Oh, man, we were so close. This would have been like the perfect religion for leftist white women, and now, well, that one thing ruined it all. Anyways, let's check the comments section here. Oh no, don't let women take that power. Well, there's a reason you've never met a Cathar today. Let's just put it that way. Cancel them from religious power. They will be cancelled. Not in a very nice way either. Now, according to Cathars, God had two wives, Kolam and Hulibam. but decided that Satan's wife was actually hotter than both of them, which is what caused Satan and God to break up their friendship. So weird explanation, to say the least. Now, Cathars believed that women's appeal to men was preventing them from rejecting the material world, which is probably true. And because of this, they were very against sex because it continued the chain of reincarnation and suffering. And so because of this, they did not get married, and I also assume they didn't have sex either. They subscribed to the Book of Enoch, according to which Eve's daughters had relations with demons and gave birth to giants. However, the existence of these demons revealed that Satan was not really God, so he decided to flood the earth. Now, in 1147, Pope Eugene III decided to respond to the Cathar threat by sending a legate, but he was able to achieve very little. Later on, in 1181, Henry of Marseille, the Cardinal Bishop of Albano, tried to convert the Cathars with a bit more than the gospel, but even after capturing the fort at Lavore, he failed to stop their spread. When Pope Innocent III came to power in 1198, he decided that he would try a new approach to the Cathars. So in 1179, the Pope called the Third Council of the Lateran, which the Catholic Church considers as their 11th ecumenical council. It condemned Catharism and pushed for the restoration of discipline among the clergymen. It confirmed only cardinals could elect the Pope, and a two-thirds majority was necessary for the result to be valid. It banned anyone under 30 from becoming a bishop, banned priests from charging money to administer the sacraments because apparently that was a thing back then, and also banned them from having women in their houses or randomly visiting nuns without a good reason, which, I guess goes to show a lot of things have not changed. And also excommunicated all gay priests because apparently that was a problem going on even 850 years ago. Thank you, Mr. Welch. The perfect lipstick for women pastors, Gorilla Glue. Yeah, I've seen that meme. I guess Uncle Sam left. That's too bad. I guess he got bored after the crusade ended. He was like, nah, I'm done with this. Yeah, I figured. No, he left because I mentioned that the Catholic Church banned all gay priests. That's why he left. Or maybe he's racist too, I don't know. Why are you gay? Now, this council also banned those who lent money, banned Muslims and Jews from owning Christian servants, and declared that if a Christian accused the Jew, he was automatically right, regardless of the actual evidence. Also, any Christian who lived for the Jew or Muslim would be excommunicated. It also called for Christian rulers to repress heresy and refrain from wanton violence against other Christians. As a result of the ban of Christians and Jews living together, the first ghettos were set up as separate neighborhoods for Jews. And nobody expects the Inquisition. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a bull that set up the First Inquisition as a response to Catharism. This Inquisition forced bishops to visit their diocese twice a year to search for heretics. It is a process that developed to investigate alleged crimes and was not solely focused on heresy. The way it worked was that through discourse, debates, and preaching, the bishop would present a better explanation of church teaching. However, the goal of this Inquisition was to eradicate Catharism and to a lesser extent Waldensianism. What's that? Well, where's Waldo? Oh, there he is. Now, right as Catharism was growing in popularity, Peter Waldo, a rich merchant, gave away his property around 1173 and founded a movement known as the Poor of Lyon. This movement was later called the Waldensian movement after Peter Waldo and was characterized by lay preaching, poverty, and strict adherence to the Bible. Between 1175 and 1185, Waldo commissioned a translation of the Bible into the local language called Arpatan. This may be sounding a little familiar to us Protestants.
Now in 1179, he and his disciple went to Rome to meet with Pope Alexander III, where he explained his faith before 3 clergymen and discussed issues of voluntary priesthood, preaching in the local language, and voluntary poverty. Now in 1184, Peter Waldo and his followers were excommunicated and kicked out of Lyon. The Waldensians taught many beliefs that contradicted Catholicism, such as rejecting infant baptism, confessing to priests, venerating the saints, using oaths, and praying for the dead. And they taught that prayers were just as effective outside of a church as inside a church. They also did not believe in purgatory, relics, pilgrimages, holy water, kneeling before bishops, forced clerical celibacy, and considered the papacy to be the office of the Antichrist. It is clear from this, then, that the Waldensians were essentially just the first Protestants, since nearly every single one of their beliefs would later become core doctrines of Protestantism. And this also goes to show that, the idea that Luther just invented all this in 1517 out of thin air is not really true. I mean, these beliefs were becoming common in the late 12th century. Now, in 1182, Maria of Antioch, the Catholic mother of Eastern Roman Emperor Alexios II Komnenos, pictured here, was deposed by Andronicus II Komnenos, who had a lot of popular support. As he became emperor, he allowed mobs to massacre the Catholics in Constantinople, which obviously did not get him any support in the Catholic West. Now, some Eastern Roman theologians declared that no Catholic should be given the sacraments unless they renounced their denomination and became Eastern Orthodox, so essentially a Kiept Orthodox, but in 1182. Now in 1187, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt, reconquered Jerusalem for the Muslims and unfortunately ended 88 years of Christian control over their holiest site. After capturing Jerusalem, Saladin spared civilians and left churches untouched, causing him to be one of the few Muslims that was well respected by Christians at the time. Now, I probably don't need to explain what the Christian response was, and it was not long after that a call for a third crusade started, with Pope Gregory VIII leading it. Now, what made this crusade different, though, is that the 3 most powerful kings in Europe all volunteered for this crusade. A Kiept Orthodox. Yeah, that's one conflict you found odd, the internal strife from Maria of Antioch. Why do you find it odd? I'm just curious. I'm sorry guys, my nose is kind of plugged right now. Why destabilize the country before external problems grew? It's a good question, but this is the Romans we're talking about. They always did this kind of stuff. They would always fight civil wars at the worst possible time. Now, the 3 leaders of the Third Crusade were all legendary in their own right, these being Philip II of France, Richard I of England, and Frederick Barbarossa. Philip was known as Philip Augustus for being the first French king to truly control the country in over 2 centuries, and this resulted in France becoming Europe's most powerful and rich country. Frederick Barbarossa is considered one of the greatest Holy Roman emperors, and was seen as the Superman of his time due to his organizational skills, and his war and diplomacy skills. But the most legendary of all was Richard, who was known as a Lionheart, and you will soon see why. This is Philip II. I've actually mentioned him in my Ancestry of King Charles series, so go check that out. This is Frederick Barbarossa. Also mentioned him in the Ancestry of King Charles, so go check that out. And Richard, who, because he didn't have any children, is not mentioned in there, but his brother is, so that's important. So all 3 leaders set out towards the Holy Land in 1189, but Frederick decided to have the most lame way of going out, and he just drowned in a river in 1190. Now, before reaching the Holy Land, Richard captured Cyprus from the Eastern Romans in 1191 because apparently, even though they were supposed to fight the Muslims, they decided to just, attack the Eastern Romans one more time. Now, after he reached his destination, he promised to spare civilians if Acre surrendered, and Saladin released his Christian prisoners as well as the True Cross. However, Saladin did not stick to his side of the deal, so Richard captured Acre and killed its defenders. Now, with this achieved, Philip II left the crusade and returned to France, even though they had not even reached Jerusalem yet. Now, the Crusaders then headed south across the Mediterranean coast, and Richard defeated Saladin at Arsuf in 1191, which allowed him to capture Jaffa. From here, Jerusalem was in sight, and Richard was close to reconquering the city he headed out to capture. However, he remembered what had happened during the First Crusade, less than 100 years earlier, and knew that most of the Crusaders would go straight home after victory. And because of this, he chose instead to negotiate a peace treaty with Saladin, which allowed unarmed Christian pilgrims to travel to Jerusalem and guaranteed the independence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was now not even controlling Jerusalem, but instead had its capital in Acre. Sadly, Richard got shipwrecked in Austria in 1192, where its Duke Leopold V captured him and held him for ransom. When he finally got released, he was shot by a boy in France, but before his death, he spared his life from execution. So, a very anticlimactic end for Richard in all regards. And here is Richard coming back from the crusade. Now let's look at Christianity in 1200. So we can see not too much has changed. You can see the Eastern Orthodoxy has been spreading a little more. Cathars have slightly grown in southern France, but otherwise looks relatively the same. However, you'll notice that now basically the pagans in Europe are essentially just isolated to the Baltics and northern Scandinavia. And this will become important. Now, while the Crusades were being waged against the Muslims, a new kind of crusade started, which became known as the Northern Crusades at the same time. In 1195, Pope Celestine III called for a crusade against the pagans, who were still a majority in the southwestern Baltic region. This time, however, it was not nobles or kings leading the crusade, but bishops, with Berthold of Hanover beginning the campaign in 1198, but being killed in battle. The next year, Albert of Riga was appointed to Christianize the Baltic, which he did by waging war for 3 decades and conquered Estonia and northern Latvia. Now, in order to organize this crusade, Albert organized the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, a military religious order which I think is one of the most badass names ever. In 1201, Albert actually founded the city of Riga, which soon attracted merchants and dedicated the region to Mary to popularize recruitment into his army. The Livonians were successfully subdued by 1212, and their leader Kaupo of Turaida was baptized. Although there was a brief rebellion, it was quickly put down, and Kaupo remained an ally until his death 5 years later. The now Catholic Livonians were used to then defeat the other pagan tribes in the area. Now let's check in on Eastern Rome. Eastern Roman Emperor Isaac II Angelos was a bad fighter and incompetent ruler, who let the treasury get drained and outsourced most of the Eastern Roman navy to Venice, which, may be a bad idea. As such, in 1195, Isaac II Angelos was deposed by his brother Alexius III Angelos, who had Isaac blinded and exiled. However, he did not rule much better and actually bankrupted the treasury, giving gifts to his new supporters. He neglected focusing on defense and diplomacy, and the chief admiral even sold most of the navy just to make a little more money. So, Pope Innocent III, this guy over here, took power in 1198, and he wanted to organize a new crusade, but the Holy Roman Empire was fighting against him, while England and France were fighting against each other. So, slightly bad timing for another crusade. In 1202, he officially called for a new crusade, which would invade the Holy Land, this time through Egypt. However, Egypt could only be attacked by sea, and the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, agreed to supply the navy, which again, remember, a lot of this was actually originally Eastern Roman ships, to transport 33,500 troops. By 1203, Venice had supplied 50 war galleys and 450 transport ships, but the Crusaders didn't actually have the money for this, and so Dandolo just refused to let them leave Venice. Now, Doge Enrico Dandolo needed to find a solution, because he needed to regain the investment he had made. He eventually decided to forgive the Crusaders' debt in exchange for them agreeing to help him conquer Zara, even though it was a part of Hungary, which is Catholic. Which is kind of funny. You realize, like, Hungary is the one Catholic country that keeps getting screwed over every crusade. Now, the Pope was obviously outraged by this, and he threatened to excommunicate the Crusaders, and many of them actually did decide to leave and go back home. However, the attack continued anyways, and after the city fell, there was extensive pillaging, with the Venetians and the Crusaders soon fighting over the spoils, because this seems to be a trend in every single crusade. Now, hearing about this, the Pope excommunicated them, and he ordered the Crusaders to attack Jerusalem, but as those of you who are historically literate will know, that never happened. Now, Doge Dandolo was not exactly a fan of the Eastern Romans, since he had been blinded by Emperor Manuel I Komnenos while visiting Constantinople in 1171. However, when Alexius IV Angelos, the son of Isaac II Angelos, offered to pay all of Venice's debt, convert the state to Catholicism, and add 10,000 Eastern Roman soldiers to the crusade, the Doge couldn't resist. In exchange, he wanted the Crusaders to help him overthrow Emperor Alexius III Angelos. Although Dandolo knew that these demands were impossible, he bribed the other crusade leaders to approve of the idea. A very Italian move right over there. So the Crusaders reached Constantinople on the 23rd of June 1203, and they came so suddenly that the city's defense was not very ready. Alexius III went out to meet the Crusaders in battle, but despite having over twice the army size, he lost and retreated, and this demoralized his men, who soon after surrendered the city. Alexius IV was now crowned as emperor on the 19th of July, but he now had to keep his promises, something which was not helped by the fact that Alexius III had fled with most of the treasury. And again, remember, a huge part of the treasury had been given to the Venetians before, more over to corrupt governors, and now the rest of it was gone with Alexius III. Now, he was so cash-strapped that he was forced to melt many icons to get silver and gold. But as you can imagine, this only angered his subjects further, because if we know one thing about the Orthodox is that they love their icons. And so now we get the funny case of Alexius versus Alexius versus Alexius. Now, Alexius IV then asked the Crusaders to help him fight Alexius III outside the city in the early 1204, and in his absence, the people of Constantinople rioted and massacred Catholics again. In revenge, the Venetians entered the city and attacked a mosque, which was defended by both Muslims and Eastern Orthodox inhabitants. Unable to beat them, the Venetians started a fire which caused 100,000 people to lose their homes. On the 5th of February, a nobleman who was leading the anti-Crusading faction was crowned as Alexius V and began fortifying the city. He then imprisoned and later strangled Alexius IV to death later that month. So let's look at the Alexiuses. This is Alexius III, Alexius IV, and Alexius V. And other than the thickness of their beards, you can barely tell them apart. Shows how lame Byzantine art was. And I'm sorry to say it, but yeah, their art was pretty lame. Now we get to, obviously, one of the most infamous moments in Christian history. Now, the Crusaders were not happy that their patron had just been murdered, and they now found themselves at war with the Eastern Roman Empire. The first assault on Constantinople failed, which greatly demoralized them, but the Catholic priests said that this was merely God testing them, and it was their duty to fight the Eastern Orthodox heretics who were, in their words, worse than the Jews. Even though the Pope literally sent a letter telling them not to attack, they just decided to do it anyways. Although the Eastern Romans were at an advantage, Alexius V made a mistake and did not pay his guards, who abandoned him, forcing him to flee. On the 13th of April, the city fell for the first time in its entire history, leading to a major crime in Christian history. Now again, just to keep this in context, right? You remember that the Umayyads twice tried to take Constantinople. You'll remember that the Crusaders only sort of got into Constantinople the previous year because they had the help of the emperor, and the Byzantines or Eastern Romans were completely unaware. But never had the city fallen in a proper siege. Before the siege, Constantinople had been the only city that had retained the structures, public baths, forums, and monuments of the Romans. The city had a population of 500,000 and was a commercial center that dominated the trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, China, India, and Persia. The sack of the city lasted 3 days, during which a large part of the army looted or stole basically everything, and then many civilians were killed. The Crusaders looted, destroyed, and defiled most of the city's churches and monasteries, because apparently this is what the warriors of Christ are supposed to do. Now, even for medieval standards, the city was utterly devastated, and Pope Innocent was enraged by their conduct. The city would never fully recover from the siege, and it irreparably damaged the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, I need not mention that the crusade never made it near Jerusalem, and instead its only result was the further division of the Eastern Romans from the Roman Catholics, and of course the division of the Eastern Roman Empire itself. In its place, the Latin Empire was set up in Constantinople with several vassal states, which are Thessalonica, Achaia, Philippopolis, Bodonica, Salona, and a few other lesser states. Venice was able to conquer 8 Greek islands and many small forts, and took the lion's share of the loot, as can be seen here with Doge Enrico Dandolo proudly showing the Venetian flag in front of Constantinople. Now, the remnants of the Eastern Romans, who at this point were just Greeks, set up their own independent states known as Epirus, Trebizond, and Nicaea. Now, the result of the Fourth Crusade was a deep sense of betrayal by the Eastern Orthodox, and ended any real chance to fix their schism with the Catholic Church. The parts of the former Eastern Roman Empire, which were not under a stable government, were lost to the Turks. What remained of the treasury was lost, with most of it stolen by the Crusaders. Constantinople had been considered a Christian stronghold defending Europe from the Muslim threat, and would never serve the same role again. It was also from this time forward that future crusades would no longer be directed by the Pope, but by individual kings, and this would not bode well for the future. Anyways, let's check in on the chat, see what you guys think of Fourth Crusade and sort of the stuff I've mentioned so far. If only Richard the Lionheart and Frederick Barbarossa actually did more than become personally ambitious, they might have retained personal domains. I agree. The Crusades are overhated. Byzantium is China. So you actually agree then with like the destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire? Okay, never mind. He says the Fourth Crusade is unjustified. The only unjustified one. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that one. That take. I think my nose just blocked, guys. Alright, it doesn't seem like anyone else is saying anything, so let's continue. So let's go back to the Cathars. So this is Saint Dominic, someone who I'm pretty familiar with because I went to a school named after him. Now in 1204, as a response to the Cathar threat, Innocent III suspended many Occitan bishops where Catharism was spreading, and appointed Folquet de Marsella as Bishop of Toulouse. In 1206, he also sent Diego de Acebo, the Bishop of Osma, to begin a conversion program, accompanied by his canon, Saint Dominic. Dominic met and debated Cathars, and realized that preachers who displayed sanctity, humility, and asceticism could win them over. Who knew that, not just killing them would actually be the solution? Now, since the church generally lacked these traits, he decided to establish the Dominican order in 1216, whose goal was to be real Christ-like examples. But in 1208, a papal legate was murdered, so the next year the Pope gave up on peaceful conversion and decided to call for a crusade. Its goal was the total elimination of Catharism, but it was also an opportunity for the French king to conquer and consolidate his rule over the south of his country. Because remember, every time there's one of these crusades, there's always at least some political motive for it. Now, the Inquisition was set up to encourage the Cathars to recant, and those who refused could receive penance or fines, or be tortured, imprisoned, or even burned alive. Now, although the Pope appealed to Philip II of France to lead the crusade, he was too busy fighting fellow Catholics, so the Pope sent his legate Arnold Amalric to organize the effort against the Cathars. Yo, why is this not working? Anyways. Now, the war started out in 1209 with the siege of Béziers. Although the Catholics were allowed to leave, many chose to fight alongside the Cathars. Once the Crusaders broke through, many inhabitants of the city fled into the main church, but were dragged out and massacred, with at least 7,000 people killed, and many more thousands were mutilated or would die later. Prisoners were blinded, dragged behind horses, or even used as target practice. To finish off their work, the Crusaders burnt down what was left of the city. Now, as I mentioned before, there were Catholics in the city, which led to the obvious question of how they would be told apart from the Cathars. When asked this very question, Arnaud Amalric replied, "The Crusaders should just kill everyone because God would protect his own," which is a very effective strategy for sure, especially if you really just want to kill everyone. So we basically get 2 Crusader atrocities in the span of 5 years. And so here are the Crusaders and bishops sort of trampling over the Cathars symbolically, and then here they are literally. Now, in case you hadn't seen enough weird crusades, I mean, we've seen the Second Crusade, which failed. We've seen the Third Crusade, where they sort of gave up. We've seen the Fourth Crusade against other Christians. We've seen the Albigensian Crusade against heretics, and now even the children go on crusade. Now, it goes without saying that basically every crusader prior to this point had been an adult, but I guess the kids also wanted in on some of the fun. In 1212, 30,000 children from France and 7,000 children from Germany gathered together to embark on crusade. Stephen, their leader, decided to prove God was on his side, and when he reached the Mediterranean, he decided he would split the sea just like Moses. However, you can imagine that this didn't work, and instead the children were just sold into slavery, with the rest getting shipwrecked or starving to death. Yeah, so that's why no one remembers this crusade. But hey, the images look cool though, I have to say. And now in 1213, Pope Innocent III called for a new ecumenical council, which would become known as the Fourth Council of the Lateran and is considered the 12th ecumenical council in the Catholic Church. Its main goals were to reform the Church and reconquer the Holy Land, and its session officially opened in 1215. 412 bishops and 800 abbots attended, and they even managed to get 23 attendees from the Eastern Orthodox Church only 9 years after having completely sacked their capital. Now, among other decisions, it ruled that Jews were separate and were supposed to distinguish themselves to protect Christians from their influence, and ordered for them as well as Muslims to wear distinctive badges. It also condemned the Waldensians as heretics and approved their persecution. So, basically this was just the everyone else sucks council. And here we have a picture of it. I think we can tell who the main character is. We have the Pope, again, funnily enough, called Innocent, who is literally here on the top of a throne like a king. I feel like this kind of exemplifies the spirit of the Fourth Council of the Lateran, yeah. Now, one other result of the Fourth Council of the Lateran was the decision to start a new crusade to reconquer Jerusalem. Armies from Austria and Hungary linked up to assist the Prince of Antioch and the King of Jerusalem to retake Jerusalem itself. But given that it was under Egyptian control, they decided to invade Egypt first in 1217. They managed to capture the strategic city of Damietta in 1219, but under the insistence of the papal legate Pelagio Galvini, they attacked Cairo in 1221, even though they weren't actually ready. This allowed Sultan al-Kamil to counterattack at night and destroy the Crusader forces, ending the Fifth Crusade with an 8-year peace treaty. Now, however, this is the Middle Ages, and 7 years later a new crusade was launched, this time by Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick liked to yap about how he would take back Jerusalem, but he was all talk and no walk, which resulted in the Pope excommunicating him in 1228, and it would only be reversed until he actually went on crusade. So Frederick decided to prove himself, gathered an army in Italy, and sailed to the Holy Land, where he actually managed to retake Jerusalem through peace. He made an agreement with Sultan al-Kamil to hand over Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem for a decade, and right after thanked him by just invading Egypt. The crusade ended after just 1 year and would allow Jerusalem to be Christian for a decade, but after time ran out, they just kept it until the Muslims took it back from them in 1244. And so I guess the question is, was this crusade successful? Because they did take back Jerusalem, just not through war. So I'm actually interested. Tell me in the chat if you think the Sixth Crusades counts as a success or not. Children of the Crusade was a mistake because of what happened in the end. I agree and disagree. I actually say that it shouldn't have even happened. I mean, why are a bunch of parents letting their children go on crusade as if that's gonna end well? My honest thoughts: the Crusades were failed. I mean, yeah, overall they were, because Islam is still alive. Okay, well, I don't think the goal was to destroy Islam, but they were a failure in the sense that only one of them succeeded. But then again, it's like, again in the chat, tell me, do you think the Sixth Crusade counts as a success? Because they did take back Jerusalem, just not through any glorious means. Okay, you say the crusade failed. What about you, Monarchist Man? Do you consider the Sixth Crusade as a success? Okay, but not because they weren't glorious, but because they lost it. Yeah, fair enough. Indirectly, yes. Okay, yeah, I can see that. I can see that perspective. All right, let's continue. And so here is Frederick II in front of Emperor or Sultan al-Malik. And this is another picture of him that looks a little less glorious than this picture. But this is contemporary, so there you go. Now, just as one crusade ended, so was another one, this time being the Albigensian Crusade, which ended after 20 brutal years in 1229.
Okay. All right, folks. I don't know. I guess it's just monarchists, man. Anyways, we're almost done. We'll end with the last Crusades, and then I have to go eat dinner. So let's make this quick. So Catharism was not extinguished, and as such, the Inquisition would be set up in the region in 1233. Those who refused to recant Catharism would choose between either being hanged or burned alive. The Cathars did not passively accept this faith, and in 1243 to 1244, their fortress of Montségur was besieged. And once the Crusaders took it, they took 200 perfects and burnt all of them at the stake together, as we can see over here. This marked the effective end of Catharism as a real force within Christianity, but it would persist for a while longer. Now, between 1208 and 1224, the Latganians and Salonians were conquered, and their territory would be split between the Bishop of Riga and the Brothers of the Sword. In 1208, the conquest of the Estonians also began, but once it started going well, the Scandinavian kings wanted a part of the pie as well. While Sweden failed to make any real progress, Denmark landed in the north in 1219 and managed to take northern Estonia. 1237, the Brothers of the Sword were sadly decisively defeated by the Samogitians and Samogalians, and they were reorganized as a subdivision of the Teutonic Order known as the Livonian Order. Now, not wanting to miss out on the fun, and in 1219, Conrad I of Masovia, the High Duke of Poland, decided to conquer the pagan Prussians bordering his territory and founded a crusading order the next year. But he was so incompetent that in 1226 he had to invite the Teutonic Order of monastic warrior monks to come help him suppress the Prussians. After the defeat of the Livonian Order in 1237, the Teutonic Knights became the main crusading force in the Baltic, and after defeating everyone else, they turned against the one main pagan group left, the Lithuanians. Yeah, I apologize about that. There's all this screaming going on in my house. Anyways, let's finish this. So in 1236, Mindaugas became the first ruler of Lithuania, and in 1252 he converted to Catholicism with his wife, hoping that this would stop the Crusaders' attacks. But you're wrong. Now, even after attacking the pagan Baltic tribes and the newly converted Lithuanians, the Teutonic Order was still crusade maxing and decided that now was an appropriate time to crusade against other Christians. They had the blessing of Pope Gregory IX, and the Teutonic Order and Swedes decided to undertake several crusades against Novgorod, an Eastern Orthodox republic in northwest Russia. However, the decisive defeat of the Crusaders by the famous Alexander Nevsky at the Battle of the Ice in 1242 put that idea to a quick end. Now, eventually the Catholic Church came to its senses and remembered what the purpose of the actual Crusades was supposed to be, which was to take Jerusalem. As mentioned before, the Egyptians reconquered Jerusalem in 1244, and the Christian forces defending them were defeated at the Battle of 4B in Gaza by a guy named Baybars. This defeat, more than anything, actually sealed the fate of the Crusader states. Now, unlike the first fall of Jerusalem in 1187, there wasn't much of an outrage in Europe this time, but King Louis IX of France decided to organize a crusade to reconquer Jerusalem in 1248. Once again, the Crusaders invaded Egypt, but were once again defeated, and King Louis was even captured in 1250. A shepherd's crusade was organized to save him, but you can imagine how well that went, and the Seventh Crusade ended in failure in 1254. And here is King Louis fighting against the Egyptians, and then getting captured. And this is what Christianity looked like in 1250. Again, not tremendously different, but we can see the effects of the Northern Crusades here in the Baltics, and the Eastern Orthodox population declining in Anatolia, but the Catholics spreading in Iberia. Now, we've been talking about Western Europe and the Catholic Church, but it's not as if the Eastern Orthodox were just hanging around doing nothing.
They never forgot about the disastrous Fourth Crusade and were determined to revive the Eastern Roman Empire. 1259, Michael VIII Palaiologos became the Emperor of Nicaea and was determined to reconquer Constantinople from the Catholic intruders. He besieged the city in 1261, which was under the Latin Emperor Baldwin II. Constantinople was captured that year, and this allowed the Eastern Roman Empire to reunite once again. But it would never be the same again, and would be quite compared to what it once was. This is Emperor Michael. And now let's look at the final Crusades in the Holy Land. King Louis IX decided that he should try crusading just one more time, and he set out in 1270 to just do that. However, he managed to fumble that crusade even worse, and he ended up in Tunis, which was part of the Hafsid Sultanate, and was 2,364 kilometers away from Jerusalem. He then spent 2 months there, and then just died, but he later became a saint at least, so I guess it wasn't all for nothing. The next year, King Edward I of England organized a crusade against Baybars, who is now the Sultan of Egypt, but this was just as much of a failure, and the Ninth Crusade is considered the final crusade. Now we're going to skip over this just because I don't have too much time. Now the Crusades were failing in the Holy Land, and things were not much better in the Baltic, with a major defeat in 1260 to the Samogitians and Curonians. 1279 the Samogalians rebelled, and with the Lithuanians were able to defeat the Livonian Order. They tried to capitalize on this success by conquering Riga twice, but failed both times. On their way back in 1287, they even killed the Order's masters and defeated his successors' attacks in 1289 and 1290. Now, this effectively ended the Northern Crusades, and although they generally succeeded in forcing the people to become Catholics, the pagans were not totally defeated. Now, the new dynasty ruling Egypt was on a roll, defeating the unbeatable Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and vowing to rid the Holy Land of all Christian presence. 1268 they took Antioch, ending the principality there. 1289 Tripoli. And in 1299 they conquered Acre, which ended the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and that was the final Crusader state left. And therefore, after 2 centuries, the Crusaders failed to regain the Holy Land for Christianity. But the land itself from Antioch to Jerusalem remained Catholic and majority Christian. Alright, so that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have to